Hello and welcome to this video. This video is going to be called My 10 Favourite Female Singers of All Time. I'm not going to say these are the greatest singers. This list is very much based upon my own personal choice, but it also takes a few other parameters into account. One of those being, I suppose, most importantly, influence, innovation, the effect on the development of music, popular music, of the song. And singers play such an important part in that process. At the beginning of the 20th century, we start in a situation where, most recorded songs would be sung in a voice that comes pretty much from opera and operetta. At the turn of the last century, Enrico Caruso was probably the biggest selling artist of the first decade. And that's an established operatic voice. If you've had an opera training, you've been trained to have a vocal sound which is essentially predictable. There's some variation, there's some individuality, but the ability to improvise, to riff, and to do all the sort of things that we now associate with popular song, that didn't exist. Once people started to record jazz and blues, the innovations made by those music forms were probably most influential in the way that affected singers. So the first person I've got on my list, right, and this is not in a ranked order, this is just in the order I thought who are my favourite singers, and also, as I said, who are the most important singers, who are the most innovative, who are the most influential, who have got the best technique. It was all those things I took into account, and the first person I wrote down, number one, was Bessie Smith, and that's the first person on my list. So Bessie Smith is the first great jazz stroke blues female singer in history. There are singers that precede her. A special mention must be given to Ma Rainey, that came in before Bessie Smith. But Bessie Smith was an absolute superstar in the Afro-American community in the South. And she brings in all the innovations that have occurred within jazz and blues. So what are those innovations? What do they bring in? Well, in terms of the blues, we've got a revolution in songwriting. I think the blues really marries up the spiritual with the profane. It manages to do those two things at once. It creates a music form which is opposed in its effect. So at once it will make you very happy while singing about things that are very sad. This is the essence of the blues. It can seem very spiritual and uplifting while singing about things which are profane, even scatological. From jazz, we get three main innovations. One of those is the ability to use improvisation in singing, to be able to make stuff up, to wander away from the melody, but more important, to use non-musical sounds, grunts, groans, shouts, hollers, all those things are brought in when you start to improvise. It allows the singer or the musician to sing in their own voice. The voice no longer needs to be predictable. It doesn't have to have a certain type of vibrato or type of tone, the sort of thing that we would expect from a classically trained singer. No, you can have your own voice. And when you listen to early jazz and blues singers, you're almost listening to absolutely identifiable voices. And of course, the most important one is these singers swing, they groove, they rock, they roll, And Bessie Smith is really the first superstar singer of the 20th century. And she brings in a style which is actually deeply operatic. She's got a very deep, rich voice. She's not singing in what we would call the female range. It's lower, it's more heartfelt. And it's that thing that we expect from the blues, is that she's also got a very masculine demeanour. Masculine and feminine, profane and sacred, spiritual, sad, happy, all these things are wrapped up in Bessie Smith's voice. And I think Bessie Smith really pioneers the basic vocal sound, or one of the basic vocal sounds that's going to go through all female singing. And after Bessie Smith, we are going to have so many singers that are singing from that deep, rich, sonorous, and sassy and strong, position. And we can think of all the singers of the 20th century that have basically come from Bessie Smith. She's a legendary status. The thing with Bessie Smith was, of course, I think in 1937, she was killed in a car crash. There's lots of stories to fly around about whether she was not accepted in, to white-only hospitals, which exacerbated her, demise. These things are contested, but I think the whole point is that however you saw it, she was operating at a time in America which was very, very racist, and she really represents, it's a very, in the 1920s, a strong female voice, literal voice. And I think Bessie Smith is the cornerstone we start with when we start to talk about female singers. Right, let's move on to the next on the list. Right, in the 30s emerges another jazz singer, another one of the most important singers of the 20th century, and that is, of course, Billie Holiday. And Billie Holiday comes in with something which is almost like the opposite of Bessie Smith. And she provides something which is rooted in the blues. It has all those attributes of jazz and blues that we expect, but she's fragile. She is frail. She is quirky, and she's very female. She doesn't have the power, she doesn't have the range of a Bessie Smith, but what she does have is the phrasing. Right, now she gets that phrasing from perhaps the greatest singer of the 20th century, is Louis Armstrong. And I'm going to do a video on male singers, so I don't want to talk too much about Louis here. But what Louis does is take the phrasing of jazz, takes the individual sound, takes the swing, and he turns it into a virtuoso form. And the way that Louis phrases becomes the way that everybody phrases. Every guitarist, trumpet player, clarinet player, drummer and singer. And Billie Holiday basically takes Louis' innovations and transfers it into this fragile sound which is all uniquely her own. If we listen to all the singers of the 20th century, all female singers, they're either Bessie Smith, that big, strong, gospel influenced voice, or you have this little fragile voice, and you hear singers, female singers will often be moving between those two basic cornerstones of female singing. Both these singers are classed as jazz singers, and they're both equally blues singers as well. Blues and jazz holds hands with each other at the beginning of recorded music history, and I think that's also personified in these two singers. The innovations that these singers made, as jazz moves into the 30s, a virtuoso element enters jazz. This really comes from the advent of the big bands, and the big bands are like sort of a new technology. They're like an incredible virtuoso machine that can take the innovations of New Orleans jazz, mix that with the arrangement innovations of people like Fletcher Henderson and Duke Ellington, and you suddenly have this controlled sound, and singers start to play in parts in a big band swing music, and in that world we start to see the advent of absolutely virtuoso jazz singers, and these are singers that can operate like a musician, that can scat and improvise and twist like the fellow musicians they're standing next to. The first really great singer to do this, and she's more than this as well, is my third singer on the list, and that is, of course, Ella Fitzgerald. Ella Fitzgerald is an absolute natural talent. The famous story is that a very young girl, she went down to enter a dance competition. She was very poor. She used to earn, bits of money by dancing on street corners, and she'd gone down to a dance competition in New York. I think maybe at the Apollo. I'm not too sure. Maybe not. But either she did the dance competition or she didn't end up doing the dance competition. But the fact was, is someone said, you know, why don't you go up and stand up and do the singing competition? And she gets up and sings. She's not a classically trained singer. She's had no training. This is just someone off the street who's listened to lots of music singing. And she gets up and opens her mouth and it blows everybody away. And this leads to a career in music. She gets taken up by Chick Webb. Chick Webb is one of the great big bands of the 1930s. One of the leading bands. Chick Webb was a disabled drummer. A very short drummer, which I think had a growth problem, and he didn't live that long. I think he died pretty young. I think in 1939, and by that time Ella Fitzgerald had become such a star within the Chick Webb band. She was able to take that over, and that jettisons her to fame. So what we have with Ella though is a breadth, and it's almost like those two elements. If you take the sort of big, rich, sonorous voice of Bessie Smith, and then the playful and yet mournful jazz phrasing of Billie Holiday, and you put those two together, you get Ella Fitzgerald plus another thing. And what Ella brings to this is just the ability to operate in a group like another horn, like a soloist. Her scat singing is absolutely incredible. If you really study what Ella's doing scat-wise, and you really start to put your ears in and listen to it, you will hear that a lot of the stuff she's doing is actually quite rehearsed. She has worked on phrases, she's taken phrases from other players. She's worked on this. Now, how much of a sort of trained musician? I don't think she actually was. This is just someone who had incredible ears. I am a huge Ella Fitzgerald fan. I was brought up on Ella Fitzgerald from the moment I was born, and I think she could well be my favourite singer. And the one thing that's always impressed me is the breadth of her singing. So she can go from such beautiful, controlled recording studio singing that you would hear on, say, the songbook albums where she's done versions of Gershwin tunes, Irving Berlin, Cole Porter, with the Nelson Riddle arrangements. She can do that sort of singing, and she can go all the way through to operating in a jazz group, scatting and twisting, and her voice can change. She can go from that very rich sound to that very tiny sound that you get with Billie Holiday. And in the middle of there, she can also go towards soul and funk. In the 60s, you get her hearing Beatles songs and taking on pop music. She was an absolute genius singer, one of the greatest singers of the 20th century. So that's who I've got. Number 3 is Ella Fitzgerald. When bebop emerges, Ella's there, and she's taking on some of the innovations of bebop. But one singer that comes in and takes that even further, and I think is probably going to be the last jazz singer on my list, who takes all this stuff and pushes it to an absolute virtuoso level. If you really want to hear the peak of virtuoso female jazz singing from the 20th century, then you need the singer that's number 4 on my list, which is, of course, Sarah Vaughan. Sarah Vaughan does have a voice which could have sung opera. She has a classically trained voice. So often what's interesting listening to Sarah Vaughan is the way she'll sing one phrase in an absolutely controlled operatic way, and then the next phrase she will twist and bend in the most dirtiest bluesy way possible. An absolutely gorgeous tone and an incredible virtuoso improvisatory style. And I think the one thing with Sarah is she was a true improviser. I don't think she was relying on sort of rehearsed phrases as much as Ella did. This is someone that understood the chords, understood the harmony, and could actually get in there and look at a chord chart and improvise their way through it. An absolute genius, and the gold standard by which I think all female jazz singing is based. So yes, we've at number 4 there with Sarah Vaughan. Right. All these singers, these singers that are really coming from jazz and blues. There's another element in this, which is gospel. And gospel is basically Afro-American church music mixed with these jazz and blues approaches. A singer that should have really been on my list, and how can I be missing this singer off because they're not on their list, is Mahalia Jackson. the greatest opera singer of, gospel singer of the 20th century. I should have had her on, really. But of course, gospel, thanks to musicians like Ray Charles in the 1950s, those influences then get pulled into popular music. And out of that springs perhaps the greatest female popular singer of the 20th century. And I noticed Rolling Stone have just done their 200 greatest singers, male and female, they all lumped it in together. They've done the greatest, and this lady came out at number one. And it is, of course, Aretha Franklin. What can I say about Aretha Franklin? There's a story I love about Aretha Franklin. Aretha Franklin was not only the greatest pop singer, rock singer, soul singer, jazz singer, of the second half of the 20th century. She was also a very, very good pianist, and she was a huge Art Tatum fan. She really knew her stuff. As a very young girl, when she first got signed to Atlantic, I think, she was brought in as a jazz singer. And so you have this very young girl, just out of her teenage years, in the studio with some of the greatest jazz players. And they're in there and they're all arguing about how this should be done. And no one's taking account of this little girl that sat in the corner whose that record it is. So rather than stand up and shout and clap her hands together, she walks over to the piano and she just hits one chord. And that chord is just so full of wisdom and knowledge that it stops all the musicians in their tracks. What is this? Who just played that? And they looked, and then from that moment on, she was in control. Now, if you want to know more about Aretha, I point you towards my interview with the great Narada Michael Walden, my hero, the genius drummer, genius producer, who in the 1980s really brought Aretha back into the mainstream pop world with incredible records like, Freeway of Love and Who's Zooming Who. And I can't say much more about that. If you want to know more about Aretha, then go and check out my interview where I asked questions like, what's it like producing the greatest pop singer, rock singer? I don't know, to call her a pop singer, even though we have all those hits and all those incredible tracks by her, it doesn't seem to give her justice, does it? Aretha Franklin. Anyway, there I am, saying to Narada Michael Walden, what's it like producing, the greatest singer of one of the great singers of the 20th century? God, these people are hard to talk about, I'm a big fan of jazz singers. I'm a big fan of female soul singers, rhythm and blues singers. My God, the amount of people I could have put on this list. There's no Tina Turner. There's no Diana Ross. There's no Whitney Houston. There's no Mariah Carey. There's so many singers in that ilk that I haven't put on this list. I had to put one on. So I just thought, who's your favourite? Taking Aretha out of it, who's your favourite? Who's your favourite soul R&B singer? And without a doubt, it's Chaka Khan. For me, Chaka Khan just has such a unique voice, such an ability to bend the notes. When Aretha sings, Aretha doesn't actually hit the note smack on. She can hit a note slightly flat or maybe a little bit sharp, and she'll twist and bend. Her range is absolutely incredible. So many songs by Chaka you won't notice, but on that first verse, as soon as she comes in right up here, as high as possible. Now, she does have a special place in my heart, Chaka does, and I'll tell you why. I came to music through the new wave of British heavy metal. From the new wave of British heavy metal, I then moved on to sort of prog rock and classic rock and fusion, and I was a real muso as a kid. In 1984, Chaka Khan brought out an album called I Feel For You, and I don't know what it is about that album, but when I heard the single off it, I Feel For You, there was something about it I found absolutely fascinating. At that time in the early 80s, I wasn't going out and buying pop albums. I wasn't a pop music fan. But I went out and bought I Feel For You by Chaka Khan, an incredible album. And this album was doing a lot of things, and I think it's a very underrated album. At that time in 1984, she was really pushing 80s production techniques. And in many cases when artists do that, they really get it wrong. But I think Chaka got it really right on that. She's bringing in rap influences, lots of sequencing, lots of sampling. And I think the reason for that is because she just has such a great pop voice, and she is able to transform that material with her jazz chops. You could then go all the way to the other extreme and check out her singing, you know, Night in Tunisia with the Brecker Brothers. I've got her on albums with Chick Corea and Lenny White, you know, the Griffith Park collection where she's singing jazz standards. She really is such an incredible singer with such a breadth of ability. Okay, so that's who I've got at number 6, right? And number 7, right, I'm moving up into the rock era. I've only got 10 choices. There's loads of singers I've missed here. So I think I have to put in at number 7, Joni Mitchell. Joni Mitchell, for me, is the greatest songwriter of the last 50, 60 years, without a doubt. Talking to people, I think people sometimes find Joni's voice a little difficult. Joni Mitchell is a virtuoso singer. She's come up through the folk route, but she's also grown up listening to a lot of the vocalese, jazz vocal ensembles. I'm thinking of things like Lambert, Hendricks and Ross. And she could sing like stuff like that. When you start to listen to later on with doing the Mingus stuff, you can hear it scatting and singing lines, and in many cases those lines are rehearsed and nailed, and she's able to traverse her way through vocally. So what you have here with Joni Mitchell is a sort of folk sonority in her tone, you know, which you could compare to a singer like Joan Baez, but also the knowledge of jazz and jazz vocal approaches. Her singing is absolutely pure, and she will traverse between jazz and folk styles. I'm thinking of, if you listen to her sing Woodstock, at the end of Woodstock, which is just piano and vocals, she goes off on an almost like scatting. She starts to improvise, but she's yodeling. She's phrasing like a jazz musician, but the phrases aren't jazz phrases. It's more folky, yodely phrases. This is nuclear physics singing. And that's why people find it difficult. Those who want something that sounds soft and nice, you know, to sing these pretty songs by, that's not what you get with Joni. With Joni, you get a precision. And the reason is because she's a songwriter and she's inherited this from Dylan. She sings in a way where you can hear the lyrics, and the meaning of the lyrics comes first. She does not sacrifice the meaning of the lyrics for the sort of hedonism of just musical abandon, you know, as so many other singers do. Joni's precise, her diction is very correct. You can hear what she's saying, but she does have that virtuoso jazz phrasing and approach behind her singing. An absolute incredible singer. I've talked about her quite a lot recently, so if you want to hear me talk more about it, go back and check my video out on my 10 favourite songs and all that type of stuff, because I've been chatting about Joni a lot. And I talk about how I found Joni difficult when I first came across her as a younger musician and how I got into it. But to put that simply, it was basically listening to the meaning of the songs, because of course the most important thing, the thing that makes the song great, is what the song's about. I don't care, all you people argued me about this, you're all wrong, right? It is what the song's about. But if you want to know why, go and check the video out, and if you want to know more, I'll come back to that later. But if there can't be a better example of this than Joni Mitchell. Right, imagine taking away the meaning of her songs, right, and then judging her. Okay, someone else can sing a song, someone else can play it in a different way, use different production, and the song's still great. But imagine taking the meaning away. Right, so who do I have at number 8? We have the incredible Kate Bush. I've done a whole video on Kate Bush. I absolutely love Kate Bush. Kate Bush emerges in the UK in the late 70s. She is a product of a very musical family where there's like folk music influences in there, but also very strong progressive rock influences. On my history of progressive rock, I argue that prog didn't go away in 1977, 78, 79 after punk, that they had a resurgence. And actually what happens is that prog just pulled itself in a little bit and then started to have huge hit records. You know, I'm thinking of, you know, Pink Floyd suddenly coming back with The Wall, you know, and then later Genesis coming back with Duke. I'm thinking of things like Bat Out of Hell by Meatloaf. I'm thinking of things like, would it be More Than a Feeling by Boston, 90125 by Yes. There is a huge resurgence of prog, but prog drawn in. And there's no better example of this than Kate Bush. You know, in the early 70s, prog is a very male-dominated place. There probably wasn't room for a prog princess. You know, there just wasn't room for that. You know, there's certain... You know, I'm thinking of, you know, bands like Curved Air or Renaissance that had very strong, you know, female singers, but they never, one doesn't emerge. Once prog pulls itself in, Kate Bush is able to sort of launch herself onto the world. And what we basically have is full-on prog rock, but drawn into sort of a pop song framework. We have a singer that is vocally able to sing like that, and you take all the literary allusions and take all the complexity and the marriage of classical music and pop music. You know, Kate Bush could do all that, but she also has the charisma, incredible looks and charisma, which it's the whole package. When she emerges with Wuthering Heights, she becomes the first, I think, female songwriter to go to #1 with her first record and all these sort of things, that, you know, groundbreaking things. But when we go back to Wuthering Heights, it is such a strange record. It's a certain artist that can pull off making a record like that. Of course, we go back to the thing is that the region she's singing like that, all the technique required to sing in that incredible range and hit those high notes and all the strange, you know, harmony and all the strange stuff that's in that song. It's not there to be virtuoso. It's there to serve the meaning of the song and her idea of her as a ghost, the ghost of Kathy at the window, and to turn round the story of Wuthering Heights and to sing it from the ghost point of view. That idea is what makes that song great. And there's only certain artists that are able to sell through their charisma ideas like that. Kate Bush is one of those. As her career advances, she does not get more commercial. She pushes it out further and further. By the time she has her monster hit record in 1985 with Hounds of Love, you know, she's released an album that has got a sidelong prog epic about someone, you know, waking a witch from under the icy waters while they contemplate the end of their life, you know, floating out in the air. Oh, it's all bizarre, strange prog stuff. And we love Kate for doing it. There's very few musicians on the planet that are able to forge a career like that and have such success while never compromising. I believe Kate to be one of the greatest British songwriters of all time, one of the greatest songwriters of all time, and one of the great singers, and a virtuosity that she had to develop herself because she wanted to sing the songs that she was hearing in her head. Absolutely incredible stuff. Shall I move on? Because I'm going to get stuck with Kate and I need to move on to #9. So who have we got at #9? I have got the incredible Bjork. I'm a huge fan of Bjork. Bjork started out as a child prodigy singing Icelandic folk songs in her home country. That Icelandic folk influence is very strong throughout everything she does. As the 80s emerged, even though she is a virtuoso singer, she gets involved in the indie rock movement, and that's another element we put in with the band the Sugar Cubes. I nearly said Sugar Babes then. I did say Sugar Cubes, didn't I? From there, she lands a deal and she brings her first album out, which is brilliantly called Debut, and is perhaps one of the great debut albums of all time. In terms of commerciality, in terms of Bjork's, you know, huge seismic influence on culture, because we're talking a very big pop artist from the early 90s. Everything that she achieved in that cultural area was achieved on that first album. She emerges like a little pixie, but a little pixie that is absolutely in control of all the influences that have emerged in the early 90s. I've argued this so many times before, that the early 90s was like a little renaissance of music. In the late 80s, music drew itself back in. It became more visceral, a bit like when punk happened in the 70s. Everything drew itself back in. You know, rock went from hair metal to grunge, you know. Hip hop went from sort of comedy acts like, you know, Run DMC. I shouldn't say comedy acts, but it becomes very serious and very raw and very street, you know. Dance music, you know, disco music, you know, Michael Jackson, that all comes down to like techno and house music. So everything draws itself in. It becomes very garagey, very homemade. And then from there, there's an explosion in the early 90s. I have argued that the early 90s is the second progressive music era, and that bands like Radiohead and Future Sound of London and Bjork are the great second wave prog artists. I class, without doubt, Bjork as a progressive, maybe not progressive rock, but a progressive artist without a doubt. And she's able to pull in on that first album all those influences, all the, the sort of grunge, electronica, house, dance music, rap, all these things are pulled in. And she's in the right place in the UK with, you know, artists like Tricky and Massive Attack and Portishead and Lamb all emerging at the same time. None of those artists seem to have the cultural impact that Bjork has. Bjork's a little bit like Kate Bush. She's able to do very, very weird things because of the strength of her charisma. You know, she's a true pop artist. I think after debut, she only gets heavier and weirder, but she's still, to this day, seen as a mainstream, you know, cultural artist, you know. So that's who I've got at number 9 is Bjork. Right, the last one on my list, I knew I had to represent all the incredible singers that emerged in the neo-soul movement. I'm a big neo-soul fan, early 90s neo-soul, and I think there's some incredible singers that came out and have really pioneered an approach to popular music that we're still hearing to this day. So who am I going to pick? Well, you know, Angie Stone, perhaps, you know, Michelle Ndegeocello, one of my favourite artists of all time, Jill Scott, and Jill Scott didn't make the list. I had to go with, for me, who is the real queen of neo-soul, and the one that just seems to personify, and she's so heavy, and she never compromises, and that is, of course, Erykah Badu. And again, in that first album, you know, that is Baduism, that first album, you know, the one with Rim Shot on and all that, she defines the style. You know, it's all there on that first album. Let's go back full circle now. Let's look at this neo-soul thing. If we look at the two great singers of neo-soul, Jill Scott and Erykah Badu, we have those two vocal approaches that I started with. You know, with Jill Scott, we have that big, sonorous, operatic, bluesy, and slightly masculine voice from Bessie Smith. With Erykah Badu, we have Billie Holiday channeled, you know, a fragile, tiny little swinging, quirky but mournful voice. That voice has come all the way through from the 1930s, 60 years up to the 1990s. Erykah Badu is far more than that. If you really put your head in the headphones and really listen to her, she has that virtuosity and she has that sonorous depth if she wants it. An absolutely incredible artist, still kicking it now. Recently, I've been listening to a great progressive artist from the last 5 or 10 years, and that would be Janelle Monáe. I've been is it Arachnoid? What's the name of her album? You see, this is where I don't know what I'm going to talk about. It's what's the name of her first album? Because it's basically a progressive rock album. Janelle Monáe made an album. She's only made 2 albums, I think, and she made an album about 10 years ago, which is called, you're all shouting it at me because I know you know your stuff, Arch Android. You see, as I get older, some of these complex words I'm not able to pull out the ether. Arch Android's incredible pop R&B album, which I think is a progressive rock album. I think Janelle Monáe is a progressive rock artist, and I've been going back to her again, listening to her again. And there's one track that she does with Erykah Badu, and I don't know the name of that. And I'm going to tell you now. This is where, you know, when you get to the new stuff, I'm not so good, you see. It's called Queen, Queen, and it features Erykah Badu. I was watching that video the other day, and when Erykah steps out into that video, you just feel the funk and the soul and the coolness and the jazz and the quality and the real dealness. This is what I feel that lacks so much from modern music, which is why I can't recall it. I can't recall it because it just passes me by. What I'm interested in is the real deal. And all these singers are on this list of the real deal, and Erykah is the real deal. So I have got to the end of my video where we've looked at my 10 favourite singers. It's not ranked, it's just a journey through my 10 favourite singers. The way I created this list was basically, I picked up a pen and I thought, well, who's going to have to be on this list? Well, Billie Holiday's on the list, isn't it? And, you know, Aretha Franklin's on the list. And basically I came up with 10 singers and then I ordered it. I took a few off. I moved a few around. I tried to tell a story of the development of female singing throughout the 20th century, which pretty much is the development of the popular song. That's what's very interesting about this. I really am, you know, looking at songs this month. This is the sort of feature. Last month it was prog. This month it's songs. You know, the nemesis of prog, songs. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you enjoyed this video, then like the video. You know, put your comments below. Let's have a chat. If you want to hear more, subscribe and ring the bell. Right? And also, if you want to get deeper into this and you want to go further and be able to push the envelope with these conversations, come and become a Patreon, you know, where I'm putting up content all the time. Loads of videos, I put music up, I can do stuff on there I can't do here, you know, I can talk about things, because it's all secret over on Patreon, and we can talk about stuff that we don't like. I can play music, and it won't get taken down for copyright. Don't tell anybody about what goes on Patreon. You know, it's a little secret club. It's like you knock the door, you do the right knock, and then you're in. And then we're all together. We can have a good old chinwag about what we all love, which is music. So if you want to become a patron, become a Patreon. Thanks for watching. I'll see you on the next video. See you soon. Bye.